As someone who studies the medieval period and is a horror freak, I'm always looking for horror in medieval literature and art. Luckily for me, the medieval period is quite literally oozing with horror. Horror related to evil and demons, horror about famine, disease, war, horror even in response to God and the divine, and tons, and I mean tons, of body horror. Tarantino style buckets of blood, amputations, decapitations, flagellation, torture, self torture, diseased bodies. They have it all. The list is never ending. Medieval literature had all the bells and whistles of our modern body horror, except it wasn't even countercultural or underground. It was a mainstream part of medieval literature and culture and life. In fact, some body horrors were lauded and praised by the movers and shakers at the time, of course, in the Christian church. Medieval Christians were a strange bunch, at least to our modern sensibilities. Their conceptualizations of the self and body were significantly contrary to our 21st century perspective. The body is not as important as the soul, obviously. Most modern Christian leaders, I believe, would find medieval usages of body horror as perverse and deplorable, even though medieval era body horror was utterly fixated on worshiping God. Body horror in this period was a path to reach the divine, to confirm its presence, and to even experience its love amidst a violent world. Medieval body horror is almost entirely devotional, particularly towards, of course, Jesus Christ, for reasons that we will definitely talk about in this video. Today, we will dig into especially the late medieval period, a time in which body horror is certainly not difficult to find, and analyze religious body horror in some mystical writings, literature, and plays. Consider this a broad and somewhat incomplete assessment of Christian body horror in the medieval period. There is certainly information that I could not put in here for time's sake, and I couldn't do in a limited research time now that TikTok is getting banned. So just keep that in mind. This is just a generalized introduction to medieval body horror. But before I begin, I must also add a content warning. There will be violence, gore, and in this. You can't talk about gore and body horror in the medieval period without talking about the man who got it trending, Jesus H. Christ. Jesus' death has all the markers of a gory story. The man was whipped, tortured, nailed to a cross, stabbed, etc. Now I hear you saying, perhaps even yelling through the screen at me, but Sam, why are all these people so obsessed with his gored body and death? Shouldn't Christians deplore his death? Shouldn't they hate it? Shouldn't it be villainized? And I mean, they do, kinda not really. That's the complex part of medieval Christianity and Christianity in general. Jesus' bloody, gnarly body overall is technically a net positive thing. For Christianity, Jesus' suffering is not just a terrible incident, it is the catalyst of our salvation. It is our salvation. There's a reason why that ghastly body horror is the literal symbol of the religion. In Christianity, we could not be forgiven by the divine. We could not reach salvation if not for Jesus' grisly death and torture. Through this extension is how we end up with the veneration of body horror in Christianity, and specifically medieval Christianity. Jesus' suffering does not remain isolated in the growing religion of Christianity. Undeniably, you're all probably familiar with the infamous deaths of Christian martyrs and saints. Eaten by lions, burnt alive, shot with arrows, stoned, sawed to death. There is another list for you guys. Christian history is overflowing with holy figures who die really terrible, gory deaths. But what are you, a medieval Christian, supposed to do? Are these deaths just deaths? Or do they mean something greater? After all, these figures did not become holy until after their terrible deaths. So, gory equals holy? That's a bit of an oversimplification, but I'm sure you get the theology of it. Here's where we get to the actual theological doctrine that builds most of the body horror in the medieval period: imitatio Christi. If you know Latin, or honestly, if you don't know Latin, you probably realize what that phrase means: imitation of Christ. Medieval and early Christians followed this doctrine in many aspects of life, through charity, living in poverty, service, etc. But the area that we're interested in is, of course, how medieval Christians used imitatio Christi to enact their own scenes of body horror. Upon her sickbed, anchoress and visionary Julian of Norwich sees the bleeding, somewhat grotesque visage of Christ hanging above her. In all the time that he showed this, that I have told now in spiritual sight, I saw the bodily sight lasting of the plenteous bleeding of the head. The great drops of blood fell down from under the garland like pellets, seeming as it had come out of the veins, and in coming out they were brown red, for the blood was full thick, and in the spreading abroad they were bright red, and when they came to the brows, then they vanished. Notwithstanding, the bleeding continued till many things were seen and understood. The fairness and the lifelikeness is like nothing but the same. The plenteousness is like to the drops of water that fall off the eaves after a great shower of rain, that fall so thick that no man may number them with bodily wit, for the plenteousness is innumerable. The plenteous blood rains down upon her in buckets in a never-ending stream. Julian does not feel horror at this undeniable image of gore, but rather she feels comforted. Why? Because of this blood, in witnessing Jesus' suffering and experiencing her own suffering, she realizes something. The gory suffering of Jesus Christ directly invokes the idea of salvation. For in Christianity, Jesus' suffering is the sacrifice that leads to the forgiveness of sinners. It's what lets us sinners through the gates of heaven. It's what saves us. Suffering and salvation are inextricably intertwined in medieval Christianity. Julian uses this revelation to broadcast her teachings about the divine love of God. Through her image of the endless flow of blood, she crafts a theology that argues for the existence of an all-encompassing divine love. The gore is never ending, and so thus the love is never ending. Gore is love for a medieval mystic like Julian. Julian of Norwich is a tame choice when it comes to looking at medieval body horror. Although her sentiments about it are clearly shared by many other mystics and visionaries, suffering is interlinked with the divine. Thus, to suffer creates a direct line towards accessing, experiencing, and witnessing divinity. But some other medieval mystics take things a step further with their devotion. Other mystics, like Bridget of Sweden, practice their asceticism or severe self-discipline in far more intimate and gruesome ways. Bridget of Sweden, as part of her devotional practices, burned herself with hot wax. She maintained these wounds through her worship of Christ, determined to suffer with Christ. Bridget is certainly a case of imitatio Christi that digs deep into self-induced body horror as a means of accessing the divine, in also a very upsetting way. Marie de Oins, sorry, not that good at French, also partakes in a more gruesome form of imitatio Christi. Like many other mystics, Marie commits self-mortification, or the mortification of the flesh, which is intended as a form of self-discipline similar to asceticism. Marie enters mystic trances by cutting away at her own corrupted flesh. The mutilation, Marie seems to believe, brings her closer to the divine by inducing and enhancing her visionary experiences. Through pain and the deconstruction of flesh, she is able to gain access to witnessing the divine. As Marie imitates the suffering of Christ through wounding herself, she is able to reach a sense of divinity. She is able to more than just read it in the Bible, but to witness it and experience it in the most bodily and spiritually way possible. Medieval scholar Caroline Walker Bynum describes the symbolism of Christ's wounds for medieval Christians. The wound or wounds of Christ are more frequently hymned as a doorway and access, refuge and consolation, than as violation. To penetrate is to open the way. Depictions of Christ bleeding on the cross sometimes stress waves pouring forth, but often focus visually on discrete red globes or drops. The blood is always fresh in crucifixion scenes, but it is as often bits dropping into chalices to feed and wash as it is torrents leaping onto the heads of sinners. The mystics I have mentioned here all fall under Bynum's observation. All of these mystics utilize body horror as a means of gaining access to God and the divine. It is through the destruction of their bodies that they are able to transcend beyond the physical, body-centered world and reach a higher plane where only the divine resides. Christian mystical body horror is all about the transcendence above the body, of driving straight through suffering and pain and ugliness and coming out on the other side to something truly powerful, and in many cases, accessing a powerful form of love in specific. Body horror and suffering create the realization of divine love, as we saw with Julian of Norwich. It is the way that these mystics and theologians decipher the true nature of divine love. Medieval Christian mysticism values body horror as a devotional medium to read and witness the divine in a far more intimate way than simply digesting the material of the Bible. It is physical evidence and means to reach transcendence. We also cannot talk about Christian medieval body horror without mentioning the self-flagellation movements across Christian Europe. In The Flagellating Self, the author investigates the development of self-flagellation. By the 11th century, it became part of the test of one's spiritual purity, as advocated by St. Peter Damianus. In the centuries that followed, the practices of collective self-purification through regular whipping of oneself proliferated all over Europe. While first a strictly monastic tradition, by the mid-13th and 14th centuries, it episodically turned into public ritual practices in different times in Europe. The wider social context for these was dramatic. It coincided with plague epidemics. Undeniably, self-flagellation also exists as a means of gaining proximity to Christ and the divine, as Jesus too was whipped. However, this style of body horror takes a turn more into the public eye. The body horror of medieval Christians accelerates into the theatrical and the spectacle. While mystical experiences are generally more of an isolated, solitary occurrence, self-flagellation is molded in the medieval period not just for a private practice, but for public evidence of devotion and purification, even sometimes protest. One of the largest self-flagellating movements occurred in Italy. The political life of medieval Italian cities was deeply rooted in conflict. This shift in power created an atmosphere of civil unrest, as the Guelphs tried to impose their will upon the Gilibines who had lost their imperial support. After several decades of internal strife in the cities, nourished by the enduring conflict between the popes and emperors, the majority of citizens sought peace. Emerging in Perugia during Easter 1260, the Flagellant movement was a political and religious answer to this endemic violence, a movement for peace. However, its shaping was more than paradoxical, both for contemporaries and historians, the path to peace being built upon self-afflicted violence. With self-flagellation, we see more direct examples of body horror as socio-political and as a part of religious theater. Medieval Christians do not just simply use body horror as a means of accessing the divine, but also as a method of profound messaging. It exploits the body horror imagery of Christ for the purposes of social upheaval and creating an environment that so viscerally expresses their distress. Body horror in this instance is a social and political weapon that certainly was difficult not to pay attention to. Nagy also describes the strengthening of communal bonds through this experience of public group self-flagellation. People gathering together in shared emotional and physical trauma, utilizing the spirituality of their actions to intensify the impact of their messaging. Medieval plays in this period also harness this kind of spectacle for their own manner of religious messaging and storytelling. Morality and mystery plays frequently employ body horror as an integral part of their narrative storytelling. Morality plays are a genre in which good and evil fight over a protagonist to either redeem or corrupt them. Mystery plays, on the other hand, are meant to showcase the mysterious power of the divine. The late medieval morality play Wisdom explodes with body horror at its climax. Like many medieval plays, its characters are symbols: anima, meaning spirit, and her personified components: mind, will, and understanding. Lucifer corrupts the three characters of mind, will, and understanding, leading to the horrific scene in which Anima appears on the stage in distress with the devils coming out from underneath her crotch area or mantle. So the consequences of their sin have a physical and gory and nightmarish effect. Medieval cycle plays, which are a type of mystery play that recounts the events of the Bible on a moving stage for medieval English audiences. Certainly for these plays, there was depictions of Christ's crucifixion, ones that were likely bloody, gory, and horrifically staged, and also run by probably the Nailmakers Guild. A bit of irony for you there. Other mystery plays, like the Cruxton play of the Sacrament, use amputation and crucifixion imagery as a means of possibly quelling local movements at the time that dissented against the church and its beliefs. And through the Cruxton play of the Sacrament, they try to recreate and reinvigorate a faith in the Trinity. While not as theatrical, literature also takes a part in the spectacle of spiritual body horror. Geoffrey Chaucer's The Second Nun's Tale in the Canterbury Tales narrates the martyrdom of Saint Cecilia as she is beheaded by disbelievers. Saint Cecilia still lives for 3 days after she is nearly wholly decapitated, with just a little piece of flesh leaving her head to hang on. And all that time she is preaching in a tub full of her own blood until she eventually dies. Religious body horror in the medieval period, especially in plays, was experimented with to target the audience's emotional connection to God and religion. Morality and mystery plays all heed a warning to their audiences about the consequences of ignoring the messaging of the divine, and that those consequences are horrific bodily mutilation. However, interestingly, still in these texts, the body horror is eventually viewed in a positive light. For plays like Wisdom and Cruxton, the body horror serves the purpose of drawing sinners back into the Christian fold. It is only after the gruesome and gory body horror in both of those plays that the characters are able to reach towards a sense of redemption and Christian salvation. The cycle play crucifixion scenes and Chaucer's St. Cecilia exemplified the gore to salvation pipeline more directly by invoking holy figures' journeys through body horror and eventual salvation and accessing God. In medieval Christianity, body horror and death were certainly not meant to be shied away from. They symbolized passages leading precisely into community and the divine. In this period, body horror opens up people to the acceptance of the divine and was evoked to create a strong emotional reaction in onlookers. Bynum emphasizes that in medieval Christianity, death was never rejected. Blood encapsulated, represented, asserted, enacted it. Bloodshed and living, drops and flow, moment and eternity, violation and salvation. While I can't say I'd recommend or in any way idealize the body horror of the medieval period, it is fascinating to examine how individuals use such an extreme form of expression in order to configure and experience transcendence. If you've ever seen the movie Martyrs, you're probably thinking about it a lot as you're watching this video. And that is because this essence of horror has continued on till today. Alright, that's it for the video today. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions or burning thoughts that you want to share. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this essay and want more horror or medieval related content.